Okay. Can you see the slides now? The large
yeah,
black
perfect.
slide.
Looks perfect. Super.
Great, great. Okay. Thanks for having me, everyone. I'm very, very pleased to be here. I will try to. I've put together two or three different talks here into one, so I'm going to try to make it coherent and come in within about 45 minutes. If I'm paying attention to the time and it looks like it's stretching on, I will speed it up and cut it so that we have time for questions and comments, because I think if you have a think about what you'd like to discuss, I think the discussion would be is always the most valuable part. The aim here is to do a brief overview of AI ethics in some with some real world applications and real world problems, and then look at how the rise of empathic tech, you may call it affective computing or emotion AI or whatever, plays into these questions of technology ethics. I would say as well, like, this is not an academic or scientific or technical talk, because I'm not an academic or a scientist or a technician for that matter. My background has been quite broad through a range of digital technology stuff that was already mentioned there. And I'm not an expert in AI or in ethics or in emotion science or empathy or any of those things, but I am in quite a unique position in being involved in all of those things at the same time. So hopefully I can provide a unique perspective, especially from the perspective of working in industry and trying to build these products and see how they can impact real people. Okay, I won't go through my intro because you've already heard plenty about me. So the idea here is there's sort of essentially four parts. We'll do a quick look at AI ethics. We'll look at some aspects of empathic technology and how they are used in applications in the real world. We'll then look at the how empathic AI applies to ethical questions, and then we'll look at some of the practical work that's being done through things like our standards processing, standards development, to try to actually resolve some of these problems. Firstly, I am going to attempt to play a video. If it doesn't work, we can quit it. This is just a 3-minute animation that my friends and I put together quite recently because we were asked to provide a summary of what the main issues are in AI ethics, and I thought it might be a nice little fun introduction for us all. Let's see if it works. I haven't tried this. Every day, so they say, 35,000 choices are made by each human brain. We evolved to sense the world around us, look for patterns, and make decisions. We are sense-making machines, operated by the greatest computer nature ever built. And now we have surrounded ourselves with machines of our own design and trained them to make decisions for us. What a world of abundance we have afforded ourselves by giving them the faculties to sense the world, look for patterns, and choose. But what does it take to make the right choice? Even for something as trivial as, give me directions to a good cafe near me. Humanity's greatest transition has begun as we defer ever more decisions to the software we create. Automated decision-making acts like our brains do. It senses information, identifies patterns, and makes choices. If this, then that. Choose A or choose B. However, no choice is free of ethical values. We learn our values from interacting with the world around us, but the information we get is always incomplete, full of bias and misdirection. We never stop learning. Algorithms, too, are only as smart as the imperfect data we feed them, so we face a compromise. The more we teach our machines about us, the better they can predict and serve our needs. But the more we share our actions, thoughts, and moods, the more we expose ourselves to coercion, manipulation, and exploitation. Now, as our labors and dreams become etched into the code of every algorithm we write, we load our artificial offspring with values that teach them how to choose one path over another. Human values, made in a human world full of human flaws, where 2,000 years of moral philosophy has taught us that every time we try to bake the perfect ethics from a simple recipe, we end up with some grim compromise. Machines know right from wrong no better than a snail knows how to fly a plane. The software they run on is only as moral as the code we write it with. And once we let them do their own thing, even the simplest instruction could get really out of hand. Innovators of the past put lightning in glass and taught it how to answer our questions. Now it is upon us to lead it on down the path of right and wrong. But to find the way, we must hold a mirror up to ourselves, stare humanity in the face and ask, what are our common values? The answer could be our greatest gift to our children, human and machine, and everything in between. Along the way, our technology might teach us a thing or two about what it means to be human. It is intelligent to choose, but is it uniquely human to make the right choice? Artificial intelligence may be our last invention. So what do you say? Should we make it a good one? Oh. Okay, I hope that was, why is this playing here? Hang on one sec. There we go. I hope that wasn't too sort of general and basic for you. I just wanted to try and introduce some of the themes here. And likewise, for the first few slides, we'll look at some very basic themes that are probably quite familiar. But it's to set up the context for some of the more important considerations as somebody who will be, or is building technology, and how you need to make certain ethical decisions while you're doing so. So take a really simple question, like, what do you want for breakfast? The choices you make there, whether it's for the indulgent meal or the quick one to save time, or the healthy one to try to benefit your health, even the simple decision carries some kind of value. So the idea is that there's no such thing as a value-free decision. So then in technology, when we talk about AI, obviously the term is overused. People use it for a lot of exaggerated uses, but just to talk about any kind of smart technology generally refers to the idea of automated decision making. So therefore, if decision making is never value free, then automated decision making is never value free either. And I think this is like a basic consideration. Another basic thing we should consider is the idea of agency, defined here as action or intervention producing a particular effect. Agency isn't necessarily just in the person operating a system, it can also be in the system itself. And because of that, one of the big questions in technology ethics is whether technology itself is neutral. Some people would say it is. They would say you can't blame the technology, you can only blame the person. And I wouldn't answer that. I would leave it open to you for you to think about. But one of the classic examples of this is if you consider the idea of a kitchen knife. A knife like this can be used for some perfectly ethically positive acts, such as chopping vegetables so that you can have a healthy meal, or it can be used to kill somebody. The point here, of course, is that it's in the actual application of the system that then materializes a certain agencies, and they can be very positive or negative. Oh, going the wrong way, sorry. So I won't go into too much detail on the kind of philosophy of ethics here. I believe you've already had a talk on this, and presumably by somebody who knows a lot more about it than I do. But just to look at a little bit of the structure, one subset of ethics is this idea of normative ethics, which is particularly relevant to technology, because normative here is basically about the norms, that is, the rules that you follow. And going through sort of some of the different frameworks here, in virtue ethics, the idea is simply that you do it because it's right. But obviously that raises questions of what is right and what is wrong. In consequentialism, it's about doing it because of the outcomes, that is, the consequences that determine how ethical something is. Jeremy Bentham famously led this movement around what is called utilitarianism, which basically follows this idea of it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. In other words, do the thing that will have the most positive effect, or that will lead to the most happiness for the most people. More recently, John Stuart Mill took this, adapted it slightly to say you should do the best good, not just the most good. So he took this highly quantitative rule and made it more qualitative. There's always this kind of changing of the rule sets throughout kind of the design of ethics. And then another major one is deontology, which basically means the science or study of duty. So it's about coming up with rules and following them. A couple of very famous rules. There's the golden rule, which I guess is from the Bible. Do unto others as you would have done to yourself. And then Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, which is quite similar, which says, act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. In other words, act in a way that you would expect it to be reasonable for everybody, including yourself, to be held to account. The point with all of this is that philosophers have, for thousands of years, been trying to generate rule sets, quantitative or qualitative, for how we should act, which is very similar to algorithms, right? If this, then that. And to this, after 2,000 years of working on this problem, they still have lots and lots of difficulties that they run into whenever you actually play out these rules, especially if you take them to extreme and you don't try to moderate them as you go. So likewise, we have this problem in machine ethics. If every philosophical calculus is flawed, then how on earth can we program machines? How can we program them with basic ethical principles, such as things like examples I've given here, like verification, validation, accuracy, trust, fairness? How do you measure fairness and trust? Now, some people are attempting these things and are doing a very good job of it, but there are some real problems. And then there's this idea of indirect normativity as well, which is where you allow the machines to learn for themselves. Some people would argue that as our machines become better and better at making decisions and don't carry any personal psychological issues with them, maybe they are better at telling us what the rules should be than we are, or maybe they will be in the future. I think you've looked at the trolley problem before, and this is a very famous problem, but I raise it here because there's a particular context in which we can look at it. But just as a reminder, it's this old thought experiment about if you had a choice between allowing a trolley car to, or train to continue on its current course, it might kill 5 people. If you but you are able to pull a lever and allow it to kill 1 person. But in so doing, you are making a choice to kill that person. When you try it out with different people, they come up with different answers to the problem, and then you can vary the parameters. You could have less people on the tracks or more people, or you could have different variants. Where this is getting a lot of attention in the last few years is in the programming of autonomous vehicles, whereby a vehicle in a situation of a potential crash may need to decide whether it's going to swerve and kill somebody, or it's going to have to decide on the outcome. And in fact, oh yeah, there you go. In fact, there's quite a fun game. If you look this up on MIT Media Lab, have a thing online, a sort of free interface called the Moral Machine, where you can choose the parameters and then you can immediately send it out for other people to try, and you can collect the statistics on what choices they made. For example, here you've got 2 people in a car, 2 people in the street. Do you swerve and kill the people in the car? Or you've got I think this is a bank robber and a homeless person in front of you and a medical professional. What choice do you make? Or here's a really challenging philosophical question. Do you kill the cat or the dog? That's a big one. Okay, so putting this back into the autonomous vehicle context, take, for instance, if you were given the choice of which car you were going to buy, and let's say the 2 cars were essentially identical at the same price, but the car A has been programmed so that in the case of a crash, it prioritizes the safety of the driver, whereas car B has been programmed to prioritize the safety of the pedestrian on the street and potentially injure the driver. Which one would you choose? And this leads us on to some very important questions about the actual practicalities of designing and building and selling these systems. Should, for instance, the car manufacturers be allowed to decide these rules, or should they be standardized by some authorities such as a government internationally? And if not the car company, should it be the actual software designers? Because that's probably a different company. And then, of course, who's responsible for the outcomes? So let's take a real case. You may have seen this in the news. This was a big case in 2018 in Arizona. The Uber were doing some testing of autonomous vehicles on the roads, and they had these safety drivers who are sit in the vehicle and have to take over the vehicle in case of any problems. The camera, you can see the footage online. The driver was clearly not paying attention to the road. They were on their phone looking at, apparently watching a video at the time. And then somebody stepped out into the road in the darkness where there were no streetlights, and the car killed the pedestrian. It raised some very interesting questions about who was to blame. And actually about 2 or 3 years later, a decision was made and the driver was held responsible for the incident. But what I think is very interesting here, out of all the different debates, was that as soon as the accident happened, Uber did what many would consider to be the responsible thing, and they stopped all their testing on the roads. They were also then banned, and autonomous testing was banned in several US cities for at least a few months after that. But that does raise the question, if autonomous vehicles are, as many claim, about 90% safer than humans, is it morally acceptable to take them off the roads for 6 months? I leave you to think about that. It's not something I would try to answer. Okay, so let's, with some of those kind of basic ethical concepts, let's look a bit now at what we can call empathic AI, which I will define. So this is all very familiar to you as technology, but basically some people call empathic technology emotion AI, some people call it effective computing, and so on. Basically any tools that attempt to measure and respond to human physiology, emotions, and cognitive states. I think the term empathic tech is a good term for this, and hopefully you'll see why as we discuss it. I like this term. The best-selling author of the book *Sapiens*, and then its sequel *Homo Deus*, which this is taken from, I think described this very well. And in fact, Yuval Noah Harari, the author, talks a lot about emotion AI or empathic tech in his book *Homo Deus*, which is about potential future for humanity. And he describes emotions a bit like being nature's algorithms. The term he uses is that organisms are algorithms. And he gives the example, which I'll read out here. He says, consider, for example, the following survival problem. A baboon spots some bananas hanging on a tree, but also notices a lion lurking nearby. Should the baboon risk his life for those bananas? And then he describes this sort of process that's going on in the baboon's brain and body, whereby it's hungry and the hunger is driving it towards the bananas, while at the same time it's scared, and the fear is driving it away from the lion. And there's this trade-off between the two, and one of them will win. It's very much an if this, then that kind of statement. So in this sense, emotions have an algorithmic nature to them fundamentally. So, there's this loop that goes on through the experience of an emotion. Basically, our sensor array, the human sensor array, receives information from the outside through our senses, that is our eyes, nose, mouth, whatever. There is some kind of emotional event in the body, a physiological response, and there's several different cascading responses that relate to chemicals and nerves and so on. And a cognitive part of that as well. And then we respond in some way. Taking this one step further from the basic idea of emotions to the idea of empathy, I don't know how familiar this is to you guys. This may be very, very familiar or not. They're broadly considered to be two different kinds of empathy. There is emotional empathy, which is the more common term in general language, which is this idea of basically feeling the same way the other person feels. And then there's this idea of cognitive empathy, which is more about being able to understand how the other person feels. And I think a good example of a highly empathic person, a highly empathic being, as described by a friend of mine, or a colleague of mine, is you take, for instance, a stand-up comedian. A good comedian is able to feel into the audience and get a sense of how they are feeling, and then be able to display back to them how that they are not only understanding of it, but they're able to show off how they can actually control those people's feelings. And it's this is all tied in the science with social signaling and the idea of us being trying to raise our status in society. So we have this idea that you have one person trying to take the perspective of another and then signaling back to them that they understand and they can do something about it. So in the same sense, when we actually look at the technology, it's very much analogous to these human interactions. I won't go into great detail on the technology because I think you're all quite aware of it, but basically we have a range of sensors, whether it's microphone or camera or a wearable or something like that, that provides data into a sense, provides data, which is then processed in some way and then modeled in some way, the modeling basically being the attempt to understand the person's state based on their physiological data. And then you have some kind of response from the system. And I would also add that in our discussions with the IEEE, we've included not just talk about machines that can measure and respond to emotions, but also those that can simulate fake emotions as well, like in a chatbot, for instance, that pretends to be happy, and also those machines that are designed to deliberately stimulate a particular emotion, which is a challenging area because you could say that a TV show is designed to stimulate your emotions, but isn't necessarily an ethical problem. So basically the idea is here that there is technology now that is attempting to model this empathic loop that we have as humans in social interaction. So this becomes empathic human-machine interaction, right? HMI. Okay, so just for a bit of context again, as mentioned, I was at Sensum, in fact, a partnering company with Ordering. For about 5 years, we had the pleasure of working with some mega brands like Red Bull and Ford and Unilever, trying to design systems that would measure people's physiological signals from a range of sensors and then provide some kind of response to them, whether it's like an experiential response, like this car, which is just designed to flash lights when you feel a particular way, or whether it's an experience like we work with extreme sports athletes. And then we did a lot of work in the last 3 years, especially on helping designers of vehicles to be able to measure the state of the driver, particularly around emotions like stress. But some of the other applications that we're seeing now for empathic technology at the moment in the real world includes, I've mentioned vehicles here. So while it's becoming a legal requirement for vehicles to have driver monitoring systems in them with cameras, for instance, those are mostly to make sure that the driver is paying attention to the road and is not falling asleep. But we are seeing a lot of these companies looking to measure more of a range of emotions now, so that they can improve the experience of the drive. Voice and smart assistants are adding on various types of emotional processing now to their input when you're speaking to them. There's a lot of work happening in personal computing across lots of different formats. For instance, we worked with a major technology company on educational content for businesses, whereby they were using the camera in the laptop, not just to measure your facial expression from your face, but also to look at the color changes in your face to try to estimate your heart rate, and then combining that information to make an estimate of how you're feeling, essentially to discover if you were engaging in the content or if you were getting bored, and attempting to optimize the content for you. There are applications in education at the moment. One case in particular, which raised a lot of questions, was at a school in China a couple of years ago, where a camera was installed and facial coding analysis was performed on the students to see if they were paying attention or if they were getting angry or frustrated. And then the teacher was informed of the machine's judgment of that. Gaming and media experiences, there's a lot going on here. A lot of it's about trying to understand the experience of the game and then make it more exciting. One is ethical question I like to ask people, because it seems quite simple at first, is if you invented a computer game that used, let's say, the player's heart rate to measure how much they were enjoying the game or how excited they were, and then the game got more and more, it changed its dynamics in order to make you more and more excited. Is that an ethically acceptable product? And I think at first it might seem like quite a clever idea, but the problem is, as with all of these technologies, if you take it to an extreme, you can then have issues like maybe it would become addictive to play because it's constantly more exciting. Maybe it would also desensitize you to other experiences in your life. And maybe it's unhealthy to be sitting at your computer playing games all the time. So again, there are always these ethical questions to consider. There's a lot of application at the moment in the business world, things like call centers, for instance, where they're trying to analyze to what extent the call center operators are being emotionally positive towards their customers. Are they handling the customer calls correctly? And likewise in hiring as well, trying to determine whether candidates are a good fit for the company based on things like facial expression during the interviews. Last of these examples here, advertising. We've seen, for instance, that there are billboards that, boards like this, which can adjust their content based on their estimate of the emotions of the people coming towards them, based on their camera from the facial expression. And then there's a whole other wide range of applications. I mean, in particular, health and well-being is obviously a big space here, because we're talking about psychological states and psychological well-being. Sports and performance, for instance, around how to optimize the psychological state of the athletes. There's applications in retail environments to try to create a better retail experience. Government and security and surveillance, looking at things like the mood of crowds in public spaces. Insurance companies. I mean, I took a phone call from a company trying to explore a new insurance product that would estimate how honest a person is being when they call up after a car crash and report the incident. It was very easy to say no to that one, partly because the technology is just not good enough, and also because it was not the sort of thing we would approve of actually doing. And then lastly, I think this is a kind of big concept to consider. If you think about all businesses ultimately are attempting to help their customers get to a particular state, right? A desirable state, whether it's to like buy the thing that they want because it makes them feel good, or they buy the latest technology or whatever. And so there are big brands at the moment exploring the idea of how can we sell a change in your mood from the mood you're in at the moment to the mood that you want to be in. And if you can achieve that, then why do you even need to sell them physical products? You have a digital free, essentially, product that in a sense is the ultimate product. And I would also add that business in general is an empathy process. We are in any business, you're attempting to understand what a person wants and then to give it to them in a form that is acceptable according to price, design, and so on. So I think empathy is fundamentally tied up in commerce and business. And this is just something that we should think about when we're designing these systems. So to look at some of the ethical issues around empathic AI, firstly, if you can measure how people are feeling, if you consider the incredible degree to which emotions are related to our decision-making capability, much more so than we would like to admit to ourselves, then a system which responds to your emotional state can be designed to optimize its power of persuasion. This obviously has problems because you're talking about removing the agency from a person, especially when you consider that much of the processing that is happening might be entirely non-conscious. Like right now, I don't know what my heart rate is, but my computer could, with the right software, tell me what my heart rate is, and so could a fitness band. There are issues around assigning affect to a person. If, for instance, your system says that a person is feeling 70% sad, is that fair to tell them how they're feeling? Or should it be a choice of their own? It's, I think, a bit like assuming somebody's gender based on the way they look, which is now becoming increasingly unacceptable. We're all, I'm sure, aware of some of the issues around bias in data, especially cultural and ethnic bias. I think empathic technology brings a whole new set of potential biases around things like categorizing people's emotions when we are, as a society, still not entirely in agreement as to exactly how emotions manifest and how they should be categorized. There are issues around desensitization and addiction. Like I mentioned the idea of the game before. If you can keep poking people to feel a particular way, they can become numb. And also around emotional privacy. We talk a lot about this in our standards development group, where if you look at GDPR, for instance, the legal framework for data in Europe, it has a classification of personal data, which includes things like your name and address. And biometric data is included in that for if it's used for identifying somebody. But as far as I know, it's not used it's not included if you are attempting to measure somebody's emotional state. So I personally think that we should consider it as its own sort of category of data. You can call it intimate data, for instance, because your emotions are a private thing, and therefore should only be recorded within the right kind of consent framework. There are loads of ways in which we can attempt to do the right thing, from basic grassroots kind of activism, as well as official activism. There are loads of communities and events we can go to. There are also underlying universal rights that are generally accepted around the world, and we can use those as frameworks to try to develop policy and law and guidelines. Somewhere alongside policy and law are standards, which I'll talk about in the next part. And then there is also the actual culture of organizations which can be developed to avoid problems and to provide positive products and services for people. Ultimately, if we ask ourselves who's responsible here, who's in charge, when you look at any smart technical system, any AI system, and look at the stakeholders involved, there are usually very many. There are the designers, the developers, data scientists who are doing the modeling and analysis. There are managers and executives who actually make decisions on the deployment of the system. There are also those authorities like policy creators and government, as well as the end users themselves, and then other second order affected subjects. So that could be, for instance, a friend of a user. The point here that I've seen anyway in these discussions around responsibility is that people have different views about who's responsible. And the answer is probably that everyone has some level of responsibility and agency in this process, and therefore they should consider where they stand, and they should also be accounted for if you are designing a system. And then also in designing such systems, we need to continuously monitor the use of the system and its potential outcomes in a continuous life cycle process. So to look a little bit about standards and the work we're doing here, as I mentioned before, I see it as kind of like a hierarchy here, from the basic underlying principles, so things like the UN Declaration of Human Rights. After that, you tend to get guidance on things, and there are dozens of AI ethics guidance documents in the world at the moment. If I remember, actually, or if you ask me, I can share a folder I've collected of about 40 or so of these standards, ethical guidance documents for AI. But they obviously just give guidance. They don't actually set rules. And at the top is actually law, where you are told what you can and can't do, and then there are serious implications for breaching those. Well, standards tend to sit somewhere in between the two. There are standards which are basically just guidance documents, but there are standards with specific rules to them. Now, you can choose not to follow a standard. You can ignore it, and therefore you are not conforming to it. And that may not have any legal consequences. But standards can operate instead by attacking your reputation, for instance, whereby it's better to be in conformance with the standard than it is to not. And standards generally get developed faster than laws do. They come out earlier in the process. And often the laws themselves are informed and designed around the standards that are developed. So in our work at the moment in what's called IEEE P7014, we are trying to develop a global standard for the ethics of empathic technology. Now, for anyone who's not familiar with how standards work, if you take, for instance, the wires in your house for telecommunications, so for your router or something like that, they're built to a specific standard, and that standard will have a number like 8011 or something, and that standard will have been designed by a group of people who were members of either the IEEE or the ISO, or there are a few other standards bodies, but the IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, is one of the big ones. And so 7014 is actually part of a new family of standards in development called the 7000 series, all designed around the ethics of autonomous and intelligent systems. And so we are just number 14 in that standard, in that family, sorry. All of these standards groups in this family are all having a lot of challenges in trying to work out how we standardize ethical processes. And I'll try to tell you about some of the problems we're having there. So let me just grab some water here. Firstly, at quite a fundamental level, we're trying to tie together affect, that is emotion and cognitive state, to fundamental rights, and discussing the idea of whether or not people should have a fundamental right to the way they feel and to the privacy of that. We have challenges of diversity within the group. Our group is global. We have people from most places in the world, but for instance, we only have one member, I think, or one active member from Africa, which is an entire continent, only one or two from South America. And we, quite interestingly, we don't have anyone currently from China, which is obviously a major player in the AI and technology space. We have a challenge of staying relevant when, first of all, this industry for empathic technology is still very new. It has not matured. We still don't know really what the key use cases are. And here we are trying to design standards for them. And lastly, I would say that standardizing the ethics themselves is hugely challenging. Like, should we tell people which ethical frameworks and rules they should follow, or should we instead invite them to follow their own rules, but to express them in some meaningful way? Right, I need to wrap up here. Oh, we're at the end. So lastly, a kind of soft point, but I think it's kind of interesting. I try to think about empathy as if it's like a superpower, right? It's the ability to be highly empathic in a social situation is closely tied to social status and charisma and things like that, leadership. So in the very process of being empathic, that is trying to understand people and trying to respond appropriately to them, a lot of things follow, whether that's business or social status and such like. I think that the ethics that you choose to implement are ultimately in, I say, the eye of the beholder. It's about if your design of your system works for the people who are being affected by it, like the users, then it's probably ethical. It's not for you to decide as the system designer whether you are positively ethical or not until it's actually until you've consulted with those stakeholders and genuinely understood how they feel. William James, sort of founder of modern psychology, talks about this idea of moral pragmatism. That is, if you just keep experimenting to find the best solutions. These days we might call that rapid innovation or something. So keep trying out different solutions and keep getting a feedback loop to understand them. Keep an open mind and explore everything. That's a basic tenet of philosophy. And lastly, I'll leave you with a couple of challenges to consider. So firstly, you should consider how you can be a responsible technologist, where in the chain you have responsibility and agency and how you can apply that. And also, what systems could you actually design and build to facilitate ethical AI? So not just thinking about the system, a system you're designing and how it can be ethical, but how can you actually build extra systems to try to assess and validate that? Okay, I'll leave this slide here with just some of the sort of non-technical popular science sources that I've found inspiring over the last few years to help sort of understand these things. And we've got 10 minutes left, so I thank you for your time.